Picture this. A single $40 late fee for a VHS copy of Apollo 13. Sounds like a minor annoyance, right? But that one penalty didn't just frustrate a customer, it literally birthed Netflix and eventually brought down an $8 billion empire. Welcome to the Overthought Files. Today, we aren't just looking at a company that failed to adapt to the internet. We're dissecting a corporate giant that, at every single critical juncture, actively chose to destroy itself. Blockbuster's death was absolutely not an accident. It was a self-inflicted corporate tragedy. Let's rewind to 1997. A guy named Reed Hastings forgets to return that infamous VHS tape to his local Blockbuster.
And boom, he gets hit with that $40 late fee. But rather than just pay it and move on, that frustrating, totally exorbitant penalty sparked a massive idea. It set in motion the total, utter collapse of what would become a $6.1 billion cultural juggernaut.
So let's get right into Act 1, the peak and the trap. You really have to understand just how massive Blockbuster was to grasp how hard they fell. Listen to these metrics from their 2004 peak. We're talking over $6.1 billion in annual revenue, a sprawling physical footprint of over 9,000 stores across 26 countries. Yeah, they had 84,000 employees serving 65 million active users. I mean, that's a towering 40% market share in the US alone. But if you compare that to a very young Netflix, Netflix is sitting at just $500 million in revenue and exactly 0 stores. They relied entirely on centralized postal hubs. Right, and that right there is the trap. Blockbuster's massive physical footprint looked like this impenetrable moat to competitors. But in reality, it was an enormous, incredibly heavy anchor. And here is the really dirty secret behind their entire business model. Back in the year 2000, $800 million, which is a wild 16% of their total revenue, came purely from late fees.
It's honestly incredible. Blockbuster was dangerously, almost fatally addicted to punishing its own customers. Just think about how terrible it is to build a business model that relies on your customers failing to follow the rules.
Exactly. Their cash flow literally thrived when you, the customer, experienced a frustrating delay. It was a complete misalignment of incentives. They were relying on hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties just to keep their margins afloat. Which brings us to Act 2, the $50 million mistake. Okay, the year is 2000. Picture the scene in Dallas. Reed Hastings travels there to meet with Blockbuster CEO John Antioco. Hastings' startup, Netflix, is struggling, to put it mildly.
Yeah, they have about 300,000 subscribers, but they are bleeding cash. They're totally desperate. So Hastings essentially begs. He offers to sell Netflix to Blockbuster for a mere $50 million. He proposes a partnership, right? Netflix would run Blockbuster's online and mail service infrastructure, while Blockbuster keeps dominating the physical retail space.
So, why would a multi-billion-dollar company laugh at the future? Because that's exactly what happened here. Blockbuster's leadership just entirely dismissed the acquisition. They practically laughed Netflix right out of the room. They rejected the mail-order rental market entirely, calling it an unviable, unprofitable niche. I mean, talk about catastrophic hubris. They voluntarily surrendered early leadership in digital logistics and dynamic algorithms, all for a price tag of just $50 million. Let's move on to Act 3, the Viacom debt trap. Now, while that Netflix rejection gets all the flashy headlines today, this was the quiet financial maneuver that really crippled them. $905 million. Right, so in October 2004, the media giant Viacom decided to formally spin off Blockbuster. But to execute this, Viacom forced Blockbuster to pay a massive special cash dividend of $5 per share. In plain English, Viacom treated Blockbuster like a giant piggy bank, shaking out all the cash before kicking them out of the house. To afford that massive payout, Blockbuster had to instantly issue $905 million in debt. Literally overnight, right on the eve of massive technological disruption, they were saddled with almost $1 billion in instant liability. Decades later, Reed Hastings himself pointed to this exact moment. He said, "The 2004 debt burden was the decisive factor that prevented Blockbuster from funding a digital strategy to stop Netflix." That is the absolute smoking gun right there. Debt kills agility. That nearly $1 billion burden just choked their operational liquidity. It starved them of the capital they desperately needed to go out and build servers, secure digital streaming licenses, and actually compete in the impending digital age. That sets us up perfectly for Act 4, the zero fees disaster. Now, absolutely desperate to stop the bleeding of customers over to Netflix's subscription model, Blockbuster panicked. In late 2004, CEO Johnny Antioco announced the No More Late Fees campaign.
The internal math on this was just terrifying.
To win back consumer loyalty, Blockbuster projected this move would obliterate $250 to $300 million in annual operating revenue. Plus, it would cost another $50 million just to implement and advertise. So from a purely rational business perspective, they were voluntarily killing a $300 million cash cow just for a desperate PR win. And the execution? Incredibly deceptive. First, after a 7-day grace period, the stores simply assumed you bought the movie.
Second, your credit card was automatically charged the full retail price of the item. No warning.
Finally, if you realized this and returned it within 30 days, sure, you got a refund, but they deducted a restocking fee.
A restocking fee? So they didn't really eliminate late fees at all, did they? They just replaced a transparent $1-a-day penalty with a hostile, confusing auto purchase trap.
The fallout was, predictably, disastrous. 47 state attorneys general immediately launched false advertising investigations against them. Think about the scale of that for a second. That is virtually the entire country turning against your company all at once. This confusing policy achieved the absolute worst of both worlds: total destruction of their cash flow and permanent damage to an already fragile brand reputation. They lost the money and somehow alienated their customers even further. Which brings us to Act 5, the internal war. Incredibly, despite the billion-dollar debt and the massive PR disasters, Blockbuster actually had a brief glimmer of hope. In 2006, they launched Blockbuster Total Access.
This was honestly an amazing strategy. It was a paid monthly subscription for mail delivery, exactly like Netflix, but it featured one incredible advantage: immediate, free in-store exchanges.
Right. So you get a movie in the mail, you watch it, and then you just instantly swap it at your local Blockbuster for a brand new release. It was absolute genius. They turned their 9,000 retail stores into a last-mile logistics network. They were essentially pioneering omni-channel retail years before it became a tech buzzword. And it worked. It quickly captured 2 million subscribers, pulling market share directly away from Netflix. But here's the catch. This hybrid model was extremely expensive, and it ignited a classic corporate civil war. On one side, you have CEO John Antioco. He's the visionary willing to take a hit to win the war. He wanted to fund Total Access aggressively to crush Netflix, even if it meant sacrificing short-term margins in the physical stores. And on the other side, you have activist investor Carl Icahn. Now, Icahn had bought his way onto the board, but he was very much a spreadsheet-focused investor who completely missed the big picture. He fundamentally misunderstood the digital war. Icahn prioritized short-term store profitability and demanded they stop giving away expensive in-store inventory for free. Well, Icahn won the war. Antioco was pushed out in 2007, replaced by Jim Keyes, a former 7-Eleven executive. Keyes viewed Blockbuster purely as a traditional physical retailer. Just listen to this quote from Keyes upon taking over. "Mail-order DVDs are a limited niche." Oh man, that has aged horrifically. A limited niche? He immediately dismantled Total Access, he imposed new fees on in-store exchanges, and he completely slashed digital advertising. He literally killed the only weapon that was actually hurting Netflix. And that leads us to Act 6, the final collapse. Under Keyes, Blockbuster suffered severe strategic whiplash. Instead of building a cohesive digital streaming platform, they actually tried to buy the electronics retailer Circuit City in 2008.
Circuit City? I mean, it just shows how chaotic leadership becomes when they are absolutely terrified of a changing market. They also acquired a download service called MovieLink and pushed Redbox-style physical kiosks. It was just unfocused panic.
And then the 2008 financial crisis hit, destroying global liquidity and permanently trapping Blockbuster with its unpayable debts. Let's do a quick clinical autopsy of their cost structures. Blockbuster was heavily burdened with inelastic fixed costs. That means they were locked into over 9,000 long-term commercial leases and had 84,300 payroll employees.
Right. In simple terms, it didn't matter if foot traffic dropped to zero, they still had to pay rent and salaries. Netflix, meanwhile, ran on centralized servers, adaptable licensing, and scalable dynamic algorithms. As Blockbuster's foot traffic died, their cost per transaction skyrocketed to completely unsustainable levels.
The velocity of this collapse is just breathtaking when you look at it. In 2006, they hit peak innovation with Total Access. But by 2007, Antioco is ousted, and digital investment is totally slashed by Keys.
And by 2010, barely 36 months later, Blockbuster formally files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, completely crushed by $1 billion in accumulated debt and an obsolete business model.
And here is the ultimate indignity. In 2011, the satellite provider Dish Network scooped up the rotting remains of this once mighty $6.1 billion cultural behemoth.
They bought it at a bankruptcy auction for a mere $320 million, a tiny fraction of its former worth. Dish progressively liquidated the remaining corporate stores by 2014, selling it off for parts and basically keeping only the brand's licensing rights.
So we have to ask, did technological evolution naturally kill Blockbuster? Or did a billion-dollar empire choose to sabotage itself?
When you look at the laughed-off Netflix deal, the crushing Viacom debt, the late-fee PR disaster, and the internal assassination of Total Access, it becomes painstakingly clear. Blockbuster wasn't just a victim of the internet, it was a victim of its own hubris.
Keep this in mind the next time you see a modern giant refuse to adapt. Sometimes the impenetrable moat you build to protect your empire becomes the exact anchor that drags it under.